Here's the fifth paragraph. It says, at the same time, practical reason makes evident that vaccination is not, as a rule, a moral obligation, and that therefore it must be voluntary. I feel like we need to pause there because that's a
feel free
a big
to.
point.
So
Yeah.
what they're doing here is they're saying you don't have to take these vaccines. They're not morally obligatory, at least in the main. They're not morally obligatory. So you've got a choice here. But like all choices, there are going to be consequences. Also, part of what they're doing here is they're giving cover to Catholics who are conscientious objectors in different countries, because now conscientious objectors in different countries will be able to say to their governments, I'm a Catholic, and right here in this document, it says I am not obliged to take these. And so they're protecting the conscience rights of Catholics around the world by saying this.
There are some Catholics who do have a fear that they will be obliged by the government, that this will be forced upon them, this vaccine. What do you say to that?
Well, that's a legitimate concern that it will vary depending on how totalitarian your local area is.
In any case, continues the document, from the ethical point of view, the morality of vaccination depends not only on the duty to protect one's own health, but also on the duty to pursue the common good. In the absence of other means to stop or even prevent the epidemic, the common good may recommend vaccination, especially to protect the weakest and most exposed.
That's another good point to pause. Sure. So here's the message to the individual Catholic. Don't think it's just about you, because you have a responsibility as a member of society to promote the common good. So you may think, oh, I'm young, I'm healthy, right. I'm not afraid of COVID. I'm not going to get vaccinated. And all I'm thinking about is me in that calculation. But there are people around you, and if you get COVID, you could give it to them, and some of them might not be in the same health condition as you are. And so what the CDF is saying, you need to think about more than just yourself in making a decision whether to get a vaccine. You need to be thinking about the common good of society and the people around you, because it's not all about you.
Now, you've already addressed this, but I know that someone's going to respond to this paragraph and say, oh my goodness, the Catholic Church is saying that we have this obligation to protect the weakest and most exposed, and they're using that as the argument to say that we should take a vaccine that's been derived from the death of innocent babies.
So, we've covered the principles that are involved here. Those are, the abortions that occurred were horrible crimes. However, God brings good even out of evils. And if one is not approving of the abortions, just like if one is not approving of what Nazis did during the Holocaust, one can, in principle, take information and things from that horrible crime and use it to save lives today. And what the CDF is saying is, in keeping with these principles that we've been talking about for a long time, this is not new, folks. Yeah, they apply here too. And if you haven't been aware of this previously, may have a little bit of a learning curve, but this is not new. The popes have approved this. The Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith has been talking about this for years. So has the Pontifical Academy of Life. This is consistent with pro-life principles. It goes, as well as general Catholic moral principles. It goes back before the reign of Pope Francis to Pope Benedict. That's when Dignitatis Personae was released. It goes back to the reign of St. John Paul II. The general principles go back even farther than that. So this is not new, folks. And this is well-established. These are well-established principles. And the CDF is not saying you have to take the vaccine. It just said it's, in general, not obligatory. But in making the decision, you should think about more than yourself. You should think about society and the other people around you, because love of neighbor is the second great commandment.
Right. It continues, those who, however, for reasons of conscience, refuse vaccines produced with cell lines from aborted fetuses must do their utmost to avoid, by other prophylactic means and appropriate behavior, becoming vehicles for the transmission of the infectious agent. In particular, they must avoid any risk to the health of those who cannot be vaccinated for medical or other reasons and who are the most vulnerable.
So you got to care for your neighbor. If you say, as a matter of conscience, I don't want to take a vaccine, okay, that's fine. But be aware that if you do that, you need to do what you can to minimize giving this virus to other people, especially those who are vulnerable. So let's say you've got an elderly relative that you see all the time. Well, if you don't want to take a vaccine to protect yourself from getting this, you may not be able to see that relative as often. If you're a nursing home worker and you're working with some of the most vulnerable people, you might need to find another job. It's not that you have to take the vaccine, but what you do have to do is what you can to protect other people.
So I understand that you're saying you don't have to take the vaccine, but if someone were working with elderly people or in a hospital, would you say they're under more of a moral obligation to receive the vaccine?
Of course they are.
Yeah.
To either take a vaccine or find another way to avoid infecting these people, they have a greater responsibility because to do something, whether it's the vaccine or something else, because they're in contact with people who are very vulnerable to this. Similarly, someone who has grandma living at home, well, that person has more of an obligation than someone who doesn't have grandma living at home. Mm-hmm. If you're a young person and you're single and you're living on your own and you're not in contact with vulnerable people, you have less responsibility. But everybody has to think about more than themselves. You have to think about, who am I in contact with? What are their levels of vulnerability, and how am I going to address that?
There are also those who think that this COVID thing has been blown out of proportion, that it really isn't that deadly, that the numbers have been sort of fixed somehow, and that this is really a conspiracy. And so I'm not going to take it, and I'm not concerned about me, nor am I that concerned about other people, because I don't actually think it's as transmissible or as deadly as people are saying it is. What would you say to that?
Well, I would say that there has been a lot of media hype on this, and that that's something that needs to be taken into account. On the other hand, it is more deadly than a regular flu. It is more transmissible than a regular flu, there are certain groups of people, the elderly or people with certain health conditions, who do have much higher fatality rates than other people. And so while I think it's legitimate to, give some pushback to the media hype and to say, okay, look, just because someone commits suicide while they're infected with COVID doesn't mean that that's a COVID death. Mm-hmm. And just because someone had flu-like symptoms when they died, that doesn't mean that it's COVID if you didn't test them. So, I think it's reasonable to give pushback on some of these numbers, but this is a pandemic and it is killing a bunch of people, and certain groups are especially vulnerable, and all of that has to be taken into account.
Thank you for watching this clip. You can click here to watch the full episode. And I want to say a big thanks to our sponsors and to our amazing patrons for making all of this possible. Please do us a favor before you go. Click that subscribe button and then the bell. And that way YouTube will be forced to let you know every time we put out a new episode.